All right, welcome everybody. When starting A/B testing, there's typically a lot of enthusiasm around the ideas, what to test, where to test. A lot of work goes into actually setting that up. And there can be a bad surprise if, when getting the results, they're not usable for various reasons. And experiment preparation, especially experiment design, comes in to avoid that. No bad surprises at the end, and putting in the work up front to have, in other words, have an experiment design for trustworthy experiment results. Today we have with us Oleg, who is squad leader for growth and experimentation here at Outsides. Previously, he worked as senior product manager at Crunchyroll, and there Oleg ran countless experiments, and he made the learnings the hard way and sharing those today, so you don't have to make the hard learnings. We will touch on two materials that are also accessible to you for download: the experiment design template, which we will also going through in the screen share, and the experiment playbook. So those you can check out in the description below. And with that, let's jump in. Welcome, Oleg, and let's dive in for the first question on what actually is experiment design.
Hello, Gregor. So yeah, well, what is experiment design? It's literally a document that allows us to formulate, think about the actual problem that we are trying to fix, improve, or may not even be a problem. This can be a North Star metric or something that we would like to implement, but we want to be sure that our hypothesis or idea that what we will want to implement will actually have a significant impact, and it will beneficially be displayed for the overall business. So literally what we do is understand the problem, what is the hypothesis, what is the primary, secondary metrics, and a list of checks that we are doing before we can actually run the experiment and then analyze the experiment results.
And on that journey, what are some of the common mistakes that you most commonly see that teams run into when doing this exercise?
That's a good one. Usually the list can be very long, but I would say that my top 5 list would be not having a clear hypothesis, actually having a big problem, but not being able to define what is the hypothesis, what you want to do in order to fix something. Using the wrong metrics. When running an experiment, having a small sample size. For example, running the experiment for 1 day and already looking at the data thinking that that's it, you're already good to go. Stopping too early, again, having a big problem, making short-time experiments, or actually looking at experiment results, not taking into consideration the control group. You may think that the variant is doing great, but when checking with the control group, well, you see it's vice versa. So kind of those are the 5 ones that most people are kind of fall into without actually knowing what to do.
Nice, nice. And I also heard about the aspect of peeking into experiments. So like if you don't have that time period defined, you kind of like peek into the results and then you're tempted maybe to stop the experiment when like, okay, that's currently showing what I like to see. And then if you don't have that
Exactly.
defined. Hmm.
Exactly. There are cases when you may start an experiment and you see a spike at the very beginning. You reach the minimum amount of a user required to pass the experiment. You stop it within 1 hour and say, yay, I have great results. But in fact, it's just the peak of the time when most users are being active. But if you look for during 1, 2, 3 weeks, then you see the data can be very different. So yes, or vice versa. You may actually expect to have a lot of users from the very beginning, but users at the very specific time frame, they're sleeping and they're not active with the product. And again, alarms, something is broken, something's not working. So again, nope, we just have to wait until you have enough data for at least a couple of days.
Nice. With that, let's jump in. I think we can open in the screen share the design template, which I know you're using also for your own experiments and making sure that yeah, things are followed and no kind of like shortcuts are taken. Can you run us maybe on the one side maybe an overview of the template? Yeah, maybe let's start with an overview on the template before we go into specifics.
Sure. First things first, can you go to the A/B details tab, the first one?
Yes.
This tab usually is the whole idea behind an A/B test. Here we try to define in one single line what is the hypothesis, what is the primary impact that we want to measure, what is the secondary impact that is also affected by the experiment, we define what is the insignificant impact, or what is the condition when we say the experiment is not insignificant enough for us to continue. And also the easiest one, what is the negative impact, when the variant is doing very, very bad and the control is still between the float. In addition, for each of the experiment, we want to confirm that we have all the list of events necessary in order to track the experiment results, or actually understand which experiments are missing or properties are missing. So those have to be implemented in advance before we can run an experiment, to avoid the case when we want to look into specific data, but we do not have the event tracking at that specific place. So the events, user properties, if we want to target specific segmentations, we also can define those in advance, and already any kind of SDK configuration or setup that has to be done. For example, if we're talking about web implementation, mobile implementation, or living room device, or anything else. So this is more of like a sanity check to confirm that each device family has the experiment configuration in place, or the tools in place to allow us to run through the experiment. Go to the metric data. Yes.
Maybe just briefly on this, I like also how this shows like defining what the expected impact is and which behavior we might expect, and also how this looks like on the tracking and analytics side. Because like you don't want to be like halfway into the experiment, you're like, oh, I actually need this additional data point, or this event has to be implemented, or this looks wonky. So also doing the homework there and the groundwork on the analytics side, and have that foundation to then go into the experiment. No?
Exactly. So what is good for us when we are defining the variant or what we want to test, we're looking at the key points where we need the data in order to assess how good the experiment was. So here, when we are doing our due diligence, we think in advance what should be done, what is currently implemented, or what is missing. And when we do this, we can really know for sure that we will not have what if scenario that something is not taken into consideration. So.
Yeah. Nice. Then you can move over to the next, next
Okay,
tab.
so the metric data, this is something that we usually do in order to assess the existing experience, and also to understand what is the cohort sample size that we would need in order for the experiment to run. For example, let's take an example. We are trying to do an experiment to improve the conversion rate from a subscription experience, for example. We would need to know what is the minimal amount of users that needs to go through the control and the variant in order to understand that those numbers of users will pass through the experience, they will trigger enough events, and within 1-2 weeks, that will tell us that we have reached or not reached statistical significance. We do this a little bit of forecast in advance, so we can actually plan the experiment duration. Because if let's say we have a very large influx of users, then maybe we would need only, let's say, 5% of the whole traffic, and the experiment will run 2 weeks. Rather than have 100% of the traffic, and the experiment will reach the data within 1 day. That may be good for us, but if we're trying to be sure that there is no spikes, there is no bias in the data within 1 day, we would want to have lower traffic, but for a longer duration. So looking at this cohort planning, we can actually assess what is the percentage of traffic do we need, what is the amount, and how do we actually stretch it for a longer period of time within reason. We have the funnel. Usually, this is the main core funnel for a specific experience. We're looking for each of the steps what the user is passing, what is number of users who participate in the funnel, what is their conversion, and so on. This gives us a clear understanding of the existing experience, as well as what are the current primary and secondary impacts, what are being generated by the control group. Based on this, we can actually put a percentage or like what is our assumption that the experiment will make an impact. For example, let's say as a primary impact is conversion rate, and let's say the control group has 5% conversion rate. My expectation that the variant will have at least a 10% increase. That's the minimum, and 20% increase. And what those would be in terms of actual percentage value and user value. Because I would like to know both of those. Because we can have, in some experiments, we can have a high increase in conversion, whereas the numbers of actual users who bought a subscription, for example, is low. And there are some cases when we want to see both numbers up, being the conversion is up and the real numbers of users who actually bought are also up. So we usually define those. So we actually have some kind of a measure for defining our forecast. What are our margins? What does it mean? What is the max within that experiment? Not just saying like on the fingers to think about like 10%, what is that? But actual numbers to see and to compare. And we usually do this in advance before actually running the experiment.
Nice. And the funnel, I imagine this is also something to think about in kind of a more wider definition of a funnel. Like if you have, for example, a feature release or some kind of UX change, maybe like more deeper down in the product. It's not necessarily like just the onboarding funnel, strictly speaking, but it would be like generally the start of an experiment, the key actions, and then like the desired action. Like, can you share a bit maybe around like how to define those steps that those are
Sure.
well defined?
Sure. When I say funnel, this was a specific use case when there is an existing experience and we try to improve upon. So we have a default experience and then we are elaborating. In case when we are building a new experience or a new feature, then we would take into consideration what that feature is. For example, users interact with the feature. So user sees the page, user clicks to a certain feature, user are engaging with it, and then user are repeating the same feature or they're interacting with it for a period of time. Meaning we will have different types of funnels or engagement with the experiment, what we're doing. So these are kind of like a default steps, how we want to see those. What are the expected user actions and what would be the events that the user will trigger during their journey. So if it's onboarding, we test like existing experience for a new one. If it's a new feature, then we will look at the user engagement as such.
Got it. Great. Anything else for, yeah, I guess like on the last part on primary impact or secondary impact?
Usually here we are listing the impacts. For example, if we have one primary impact, then we are using only like one box. If, for example, we have two, then those are being copied. So we'll have, for example, numbers of users who have completed the conversion, or we would like to say the increase in numbers of users who bought a subscription. So we kind of can define those. But usually it's like that.
Mm-hmm. And there's also the difference there with what was it, the do no harm experiments, and like an experiment that is implied, like in contrast to that, an experiment that is intended to improve an experience. Can you maybe share about that concept and then also like how that would impact primary impact and impact definitions?
Oh, sure. For the do no harm, usually are optimization within a certain product that the scope is to, for example, improve something on the backend, nothing critical user related. So the scope is not to actually improve the key metric of a business, but to actually observe that the user do not have a negative impact. For example, let's say a new method to record data on the backend. Well, it's a backend implementation. But when a user passes through the experience and they're buying a subscription, if that metric is not tracked in the backend properly, we'll have problems. User will not feel it, but from a business standpoint, we will see everything go crazy because we're seeing fall down in sales, fall down in subscription, and everyone will go bananas because everyone sees a problem. But the goal is, when do no harm, is actually not impact the user behavior and also not impact the business key metrics that are being monitored by different stakeholders.
Mm. So it's kind of like an insurance policy almost, kind of like
exactly.
You don't want to negatively improve or like negatively change something during a rollout.
And for example, if we say, let's say conversion metric or the numbers of purchase, it's a default experience. Users are buying as is. If the change is made, you will not have neither a drop down in those numbers of events, neither a spike, meaning the backend implementation went well and no harm was done, and everything is fine.
And can you share some general best practices on like how to define primary and secondary success metrics? Also maybe like based on different industries or different kind of types of experiments, anything for somebody who's thinking about how to define those?
Sure. So the primary metric is the key, I'll say the key events that we are trying to assess as part of the experiment impact. And when we're looking, like, I will take again the example with the onboarding experience. As part of the onboarding experience, for us, the key metric, the primary metric, is the numbers of users who actually buy something. So that is the metric that I would like to measure. Having the events in place that will track that specific metric is something that I will be monitoring as part of the experiment. And that for me is the key metric. For example, if there is an experiment where we would like to increase the top of the funnel for a purchase experience, where we display a new banner somewhere. For me, the primary metric will be the numbers of users who have clicked the banner, because that's the first thing what the user will see. And already another primary metric will be the confirmation that the user have bought my subscription. Meaning that we have two primary metrics, the top of the funnel, the higher in clicks, and at the end, the confirmation that the purchase was successful. So in that case, those would be the primary metric. These ones are being defined based on every type of experiment, what we are trying to do. If it's a new engagement, or like a new feature, the primary metric in this case would be to actually assess that the user are interacting with the new feature. They are engaging. And this engagement is not done within the first day where they see this new feature, but it's a repetitive action that I can actually measure the user involvement, like engagement, within a week, a month, and so on. That will show me that there is an actual interest into that feature. So I define those, what are those primary metrics. Secondary ones are in between that are, for me, are important, but they may not be business critical. And for example, let's say, let me think about a good case. Users who are engaging into a new onboarding experience. And okay, I'll take one step back. The default experience is having 6 steps during the onboarding process. The optimized version is having 3 steps. So the secondary metric would be the time spent to actually pass through the onboarding has decreased. Meaning instead of spending, let's say, 2 minutes on the onboarding, users spend 30 seconds to pass the onboarding. This is a secondary metric because it shows me that the experience is simple and is clear, and there is no problems for the user to actually go from the beginning to the very end. That's an example of the secondary metric. For example, in addition would be, as part of a new feature, there can be multiple likes, adding the feature, adding an article to favorites, or follow a person who is writing articles. Those can be also engagement secondary metrics. It doesn't tell me much about user overall engagement of a product with that article, like reading article constantly, but it shows that people are having interest in this kind of feature because they liked the article and they are following that offer that are making similar new articles. So again, those are types of secondary metrics. Not critical for the business, but it's good to know to see how users are interacting with either be an improvement, either a feature, or either whatnot.
Got it. And I understand the next tab is going to be about experiment results. I think before we jump to that, I'll stop screen sharing here again. I'd like to dive a bit more into the setup of experimentation and how to have the setup preparations, and also how to mitigate bias or errors while actually doing the set out of the experiment. Are there any setup best practices you can share, and also anything around that?
Sure. So starting with when starting with any kind of new experiment, the first step is actually to work on the experiment design document in order to have a broader vision what do we want to achieve. So first of all, we are going through defining the problem, or this can be the North Star metric that we want to improve, and coming up with the hypothesis. When we know the problem, what we want to achieve, and what is the hypothesis and the results, that is kind of halfway through. Secondary, we jump into selecting the primary and secondary metrics, and in some cases, we can define the conditions when the experiment results are insignificant or negative. Confirm we have all the events in place, or if any kind of additional implementation is required, making sure that the engineers are doing this way in advance, so we will not have any surprises during the experiment launch. Determine the sample size, knowing the amount of traffic into the product or into the specific part of the experience that we would like to assess to determine how many users need to pass through the experience for the control and variant. The duration, and already start doing the stage testing, run production for full cycle, not limit the experiment during 1-2 days and then say, hey, that's it, we're good, but have it for at least 1-2 weeks in order to see that there are no biased results, and then jump into analyzing the results of the experiment. So that's how I would do it.
I find also good for the experiment design, like documenting it actually. On the one side, it holds you true for yourself. Like when you're writing it down, you notice where there's ambiguity or there's gaps. And also you can hold yourself accountable down the line when the experiment results are coming in. And on the other side, I also find it quite helpful to have it as a document to align with different stakeholders to make sure we're all on the same page on the hypotheses and the things we expect to happen. While on the other side, on the technical side, showing this and running this through with the technical team, with the development team, there's also can come up like, hey, we don't currently track that, or like this is currently not something which we can support in this way. And like you can have that alignment also early and get any kind of like red flags on the technical side as well.
Exactly. A good thing about the documentation is you know that you have, and that's an historical milestone that you were here, you try to do something, and if in the future, when the experiment is complete, if in future somebody will want to see what kind of experiments were done in the past, they can always refer to the document. They can see the initial hypothesis, what were the conditions, what was measured, what was the experiment results, and at the end, take a decision, do we need to do another round of improving a specific experience feature, or the idea to rerun something is not necessary because it was done into the past. So again, this is a good way to making sure that everyone is aligned and all the teams or stakeholders know what's what. So that's always good.
Yeah. It's a great document to like have historic documentation and kind of accumulate also kind of the learnings over time. Yeah, I like that. On biases and errors, like, is there any things like as humans, like we have tons of biases in our mind, of course, like which can also come into experiments and the hypotheses we bring. Any thoughts on that, like how to tackle that?
That's a good one. Usually, I would say the primary condition in order to not run into bias is to have a proper randomization when the user are being assigned to control and variant groups. Because if the randomization is not random, then you're going to definitely have a problem with experiment results. The good news is that the majority of existing A/B testing tools that are on the market, they already have a good randomizing algorithm that assigns users to the control and to the variant, and that's good. In some cases, it's good to also keep in mind, for example, different user segmentations. For example, if you have an experiment that is assigned for a specific user group, you will need to be able to actually target a specific user group. For example, you will not have a control group which is aiming at all existing users, while the variant is aiming only at free users who are not, let's say, do not have a subscription or never bought something, because those user groups will be completely different and they will behave different. So a bias can be like having wrong targeting, because you would want to be sure that either control and variant, they are the same user segmentation with the same variation of different people, but they're not limited groups, because you'll have different results, of course. Another thing to keep in mind when running experiments to like avoid biases is when do you actually run experiments? Because you may have an experiment which is well written down. You have everything. You have the segmentation, the user groups, but the timing when running the experiment was wrong. For example, running any kind of experiment during big holidays as Thanksgiving, Black Friday, or let's say Christmas, you will always have way different results when running in any time of the year when you don't have big holidays. Because again, you have seasonality, you have different user behavior, which will definitely impact your experimentation. So in this case, maybe it's worthwhile to not do an experiment for like improving the onboarding during that time frame. Maybe you need to take a couple of days off before actually running. So this is something that can be also affecting. And last but not least, I'm always trying to keep an eye for is preventing users, or like from an engineering standpoint, to prevent user from crossing between variants. And this is something very important, because if you're running an experiment, you want to be sure that if a user has been assigned a control experience, he has to stay in that control experience. Not when he starts a new session, he automatically jumps to the variant experience, because in that case, you will have user jumping from one to another as long as the experiment will last, and you will have wrong data all across it. So that's always good to be able to distinguish.
And is there something on the rollout itself, like for example, like having a gradual rollout that you're not like, okay, pop experiment is live now, straight to 100%. Like, is there anything like you like to follow as best practice there?
Yes. Before actually jumping into production rollout, I would say to anyone who I'm working with, like, always do your due diligence on the staging environment. Be sure that your staging environment is your best friend, which simulates production. And running the experiment on the staging environment, you can actually confirm that, first of all, the experience logic is present. It's there, it's working as expected. All the events in place, the experiment is running accordingly. As a control user, you want for the experience, and you will able to trigger the data and see the results. The same thing for the variant. You pass through the experience and you see all the tracking within your dashboard, be it you're tracking in amplitude, mix panel, or even in the A/B testing tool. You actually see that the results are coming in, meaning that on the staging environment, the experience is flawless, all is good, and now we can actually run in production. In production, I always start an experiment with 1% rollout, because assuming production, you will have not, let's say, 10, 20 people doing things on staging environment, but you can have hundreds and hundreds of thousands or millions of users engaging with the product. Meaning exposing the experiment to 1% of the users on the first day is already more than enough to actually have a very steady influx of data to assess if there's a problem, to assess if there's an early flag or red flag that you may actually trigger, the user have triggered on production, because on stage, well, you're one, you're two people who can actually test, but having 100,000 of people going through the experience will most likely trigger something that was not considered, taken into consideration, or actually was a very rare use case that can only happen on production because of the sheer amount of users. 1% during the first, let's say, 2-3 hours of the first day of the experiment, everything is fine. There are no peaks. There are no red flags. Good. Increase it to 5%. Everything is stable. Good. 10%, 25, 50, 100. Usually that can happen within 1-2 days on the first day of the experiment, or actually 2 days. If, for example, reaching 25%, we see a spike of, let's say, payment issues that is related to the experiment, we pause the experiment right away, because that's a very big red flag. We would want to catch those problems early on, assess those, understand what's the problem, rather than have all the 100% of the new users exposed to an experience which is broken. And we, of course, will have not only problems as part for the team or internally, but for the stakeholders as well, because, for example, during that day, the company had, 99% losses in new purchases because the experience was broken. So yeah, gradual rollout is a very handy thing to manage.
And the actual business impact due to an experiment is not something that is nice to have as an experiment result. Yeah, I can see that. Cool. Let's jump to the analyzing the experiment results. So because we're coming up on time as well, I'll share screen again and we can go back into the template. So what happens if we have the results and how to work with the results and how to get started in the analysis?
This specific part of the documentation is, I would say, optional, depending on the A/B testing tools what you're using. The majority of A/B testing tools already support the experiment result analysis within the tool as out-of-the-box experience, where you can actually see what was the key metrics, what were the impacts, and how the experiment is complete. For me, I usually keep this tab created just to be able to, let's say, chew down all the information in such a way that anyone from any kind of the teams can actually read through the experiment results and understand what was the impact. Because not all teams will have access to your A/B testing tool. And for example, for C-level management, you would not want to go into multiple charts with impacts, data, and so on. So you would want to have a more like chew-down approach of defining what is the controlled experience. Can you please go up? So I'm giving like the simplest example. Like the simplest example is optimizing an existing funnel. So here, like we have the 4 steps of the funnel, for example, which the user goes on. We have the control. We know how many users that were assigned the control experience went for the experience and what was their conversion rate versus the variant. We can actually see how many users went into the same experience into the let's say onboarding experience, but since it was different, we will actually see what was the results, and already we have the delta, the comparison between the control and variant. These would be for me more than enough to say the experiment control had this conversion, variant had this conversion, and the delta between control and variant is XYZ. Based on this, I can already tell if an experiment was a great success and not. Assuming that, for example, small teams or new startups or businesses that just starting to like grow, and they do not have multiple tools in order to assess statistical significance, there are online tools that can help easily and in a very informative way to understand if the experiment was impactful. So if you can open the link, this is something that I'm using quite fondly and I really enjoy, the A/B test guide. This specific online tool looks at the top of the funnel and the end results for the control and variant, allows you to select the type of the confidence of the experiment, and already gives you a simple results of what is what. And if we can look to the right, we have the statistical significance, what was the conversion rate between control and funnel, what was the observed power, the p-values, and of course the standard errors for the control and the variant. So this is just an example of the tool that can actually help you assess if your experiment was statistical significant, had enough data in order to assess if the experiment was statistical significant or not. Usually, as I said, every A/B testing tool has this. They can say it's a or an A, but in case if those tools that you are using, like any other folks are using it, you can always find an online tool that can give you a similar result, which is very user-friendly and simple.
I see here the confidence level, which is something to toggle, and I also know most tools offer that. Is there something where you like to land or what you recommend, maybe also based on the type of experiment? And
yes, usually the confidence level is a value that tells us how confident is the data in order to assess if the experiment is significant or not. So usually we're putting between 90 to 95 or 99%. This is the golden rule to actually know that you have minimum bias in your experimentation. Having a 95% confidence means that only 5% of the results are based on randomized conditions and data that may be faulty, but 95% of the data is 100%. 95% of data is 100% accurate. So usually we're looking at that. 95 and up, that's a win-win conditions to know for sure that your data is significant.
nice. Cool. Anything else for the template itself? What do you think? Or we're in a good spot there, and people can start giving it a try.
Sure. I would say, first of all, start with the first tab, understand what is your hypothesis, how you want to measure the impact of the experiment, and of course, if you have all the events and properties in motion before you start the experiment. The metric data will allow you to understand your current conversions and what would be the minimum, maximum results, what you want to achieve in order to assess the primary and secondary impacts. A/B analysis, this is your good friend, just to chew down the experiment results in order to share with a broader audience, say like what was the impact, what was done. So it's easy as that. Sometimes it's good to have like a screenshot similar to what we have posted here, not to take multiple stakeholders for the experience, how you actually are calculating. You just add a screenshot if the experiment was significant or it did not have enough data. So folks they can see the data and say, yay, it's a win-win, or no, it's something that we will go back to reassess. The document is fairly simple, and it's recommended to adjust it depending on the use cases and needs. It's not something that is static and has to go as is. Of course, the document is prone to change based on the use cases and conditions that you want to validate.
Yeah. Yeah, like any templates as a starting
Exactly.
point and as guidelines, and then customize it as needed. Nice. I think there's tons of great stuff for to get started on working more diligently with experiment design. Is there like a final takeaways or final recommendations you have for anybody who wants to get more diligent about this field and yeah, get to trustworthy experiment results?
I would say, first of all, embrace the experimentation culture, because an experiment is not something like any kind of A/B experimentation is not 100 success rate. Usually, the average is around 30 to 33, 45% success rate, meaning that out of 10 experiments, most likely we'll have 6 to 7 that will be a fail. Going with this mindset, actually, mostly this is an advice to business leaders or key stakeholders, that they need to embrace that aspect of A/B testing, that nothing will be 100% efficient. There will be failed experiments, and these failed experiments should always be taken as a lesson learned, because based on those failed experiments, we know what are the biggest problem of any kind of product and what should be done in order to grow. I would say that is one of the biggest challenge that the majority of teams are facing, because when you have 5 experiments which are fails, and that would affect the overall moral, the business will think that that's not good. But that shows us that the actual problems are way deeper within the product itself, and some other implementation or looking at the problems from different angles can actually make a higher impact per se. And of course, having one juicy experiment that brings you 200% increase in the overall conversion, for example, and that's a major win-win for the business, which will cover up of all the previous experiments were failed. That's also good. So there has to be this curve of learning, always keeping the habit of running experiments and not be afraid of failing, because when we fail, that's the base for us to learn and to improve upon.
Mm. So to as an organization to build that muscle to run diligent experiments and like to also have the right expectations that it's a journey and it's not like
Exactly.
every experiment is a home run, and if like we have 3 strikes out of like not getting the right results or like the hoped results to lose faith in the program. Yeah.
Exactly.
Excellent. Then yeah, thanks everybody for sticking around. We hope you found this insightful. You have some starting points to go by, and thanks Oleg for sharing your knowledge.